Sinistra nei Venti, il nuovo podcast dei giovani democratici di Torino. Hello to everyone and welcome to this new episode of our podcast, A Sinistra nei Venti. Today we are talking about American politics and about the elections, which are due in only a few days. We have the privilege to have the chance to interview someone right from the States who lives the place and who will help us to understand more about those crucial and very complicated election. We're pleased to introduce to you Daraka Larimore-Hall, Vice Chair of the California Democratic Party, who is online now with us. It's a really big honor for us to have you here, and we really thank you for the opportunity. Hello, Daraka.
Hello, ciao. It's great to be here, and it's an honor for me, too, to have this conversation across the Atlantic.
A very big thanks. Your intervention will allow us to get some insight from America itself. So we have many questions for you today.
I'll do my best to answer them. I don't think anybody knows exactly what's going on in the U.S. right now, but I'll do my best.
So the first thing we wanted to ask you is, from the American people, how is this election perceived? Is it an election like all the others, or is there something different? And why is that?
No, definitely. It's definitely not a typical election, though it has to be said that it's felt like, for the last maybe 15 years or so, every election has felt like the most important election of our lifetime, and they seem to keep getting more and more intense in their importance and the feeling of high stakes in them. But I think it's definitely true that all the way down to the most unengaged average voter, you could say, not a political nerd like us, that people feel like this election is special, is different, is important. And it's in some way, it's come down to Biden and Trump. It's in a sense a do-over of the election of 2016 in the sense that it's a referendum on a kind of traditional politics of respectability and some degree of consensus building, and a very ugly, populist, anti-political kind of politics represented by Trump. So we're in a sense, we're doing a do-over. It's like a recreation of the same question, but now Americans have had 3.5 years of Trump to see what it really looks like. So it's a different kind of feeling.
Yeah, totally. And this is the fact that this election is so important, or seems so important. Is it due to the fact that the US seem, at least from the Italian perspective, more polarized than ever? Like during the last months, we've seen many protests erupted in the country, either from the Black Lives Matter movement, but we've also seen some more dangerous and preoccupying movements, such as Proud Boys and all of the alt-right protesters. So how will this election affect racial justice and polarization in the U.S.?
Yeah,
what's the impact?
That's a great question. There's a bunch of questions in there. I mean, so let's take this question of polarization. This is a big topic among political scientists in the United States and journalists and thinkers. And it's a tricky one to really get our hands around, because what's on the very surface level, it's very clear that the United States is more polarized than it has been in the past. You cite the action that's been going on in the streets from racial justice activists, and this rise of a much more violent and nihilistic kind of right-wing activism that seems to be supported, at least tacitly, by Trump and by the White House and by the right wing of the Republican Party. So, that's, and then if you look at our voting patterns, right?
Mm-hmm.
There's parts of the country that vote very, very solidly with one party or another. There's a big age cleavage in this country, a generational cleavage in this country that's really stark in voting and in attitudes towards issues like climate change, racial justice, sexuality. There's just a really big difference between older voters and younger voters. Um,
Mm-hmm.
so there's all these different ways that Americans are divided. But the question for a lot of historians and theorists and so forth is whether this is new or um, or a long-standing set of divisions that are somehow now being expressed in politics. And I tend more towards that side. I think that we've had these divisions, and and more importantly than divisions, which is kind of a liberal frame, we've had inequalities and injustices and unfairness in society along racial lines, along gender lines, along class lines. And they've just been ignored or given, lip service and rhetoric, but not really addressed. And um, and the difference is that the parties are political parties that 40 years ago and for a long time in the United States were very similar ideologically. You could find Democratic members of Congress that were to the right of Republican members of Congress, and Republican members that were really quite liberal, and there's this a lot more mixture between the parties, you could say. But
Yeah.
for the steadily over the last 40 years, that's been changing, and the parties have been becoming more distinct ideologically, more of a classical left-right conflict. So these two things have been happening at the same time, and of course reinforcing one another. And I think what we're seeing is that for the first time in recent American history, the two parties are very, very distinct from one another in terms of how their members vote in Congress, their attitudes towards a whole range of social issues. And that's happened all the way down society. And I think for Italian observers, it's, there's really nothing happening in the United States that you haven't seen in Italy. And while, the geopolitics is different, the United States is a big, powerful country. Italy was, after the war, less powerful geopolitically and more influenced by the superpowers, right? But
Yeah.
these are very similar dynamics. You have big social cleavages, differences in worldview and way of life around the country. You have a party system that has sort of calcified into two big blocks, and then something that's should be familiar to Italians and has always popped up here and there in American history is this strong man populist anti-political solution. So as tempting as it is to compare Donald Trump to, say, Mussolini, he's
Mm-hmm.
really a lot more like Berlusconi,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
A lot more of this, like, not very ideological, just bigoted in his own worldview, of course, rich, spoiled, self-centered kind of guy who's like, I can get the people to love me and rebuild politics around me. And
Sure.
that's what Trump's doing. But he's part of a political party that has been steadily becoming more and more white nationalist, anti-immigrant, xenophobic, and of course had always had this strong religious nationalist, Christian conservative tradition. So all of this is coming together to create a very Italian situation with thugs out in the streets, right, pretending um, it's they're going to pull off the March on Rome, getting some kinds of, if not direct support, kind of moral support from the mainstream political right,
Right.
a political left that is exploded with pent up frustration and patience and wanting to see change happen. And some organized violence, mainly against property destruction, kind of anarchistic, black bloc kind of
Yeah.
kind of stuff going on the left.
Mm-hmm.
In certain parts of the country, nothing, really pales in comparison to the organization on the right. But anyway, the point is, if you've read about the strategy of tension, if you've read about
Yes.
the history of populism in Italy, like it's very similar. It's very similar.
Right. Right. And all of this, we can say, can have its origins in social injustice. Many of the problems have been pointed out by the coronavirus pandemic, which, amongst other, has shown the fragility of the American healthcare system. And we can say healthcare will be a key part of this election. What do you think about the proposal of the two candidates, and what is your point of view on, for example, healthcare and a socialized healthcare?
Yeah. So I mean, So it's another good set of questions, right? Um, we have this horrible failure of the welfare state building project here in the United States. That, like, if you take out the difference, the cultural differences, historical, political differences between Europe and the United States, and the fact that our left has been less socialist and less workerist than in Europe, and more liberal and populist in a sort of better sense of the word. But we also had just before and then after World War II a period of time in which building a regulatory state and building a welfare state was a political consensus. And you had pro New Deal Republicans and even big business, right, was starting to see, hey, we should probably have some planning, should probably take care of workers so that they can buy our products. All this, like, the general post-war consensus of a kind of more humane capitalism.
Yeah.
But what we couldn't accomplish. We couldn't accomplish in the 30s and 40s with Roosevelt. We couldn't accomplish again in the 60s and 70s with another liberal wave of reform, was building a healthcare system, a public, affordable healthcare system. And instead we have this nightmarish, sort of managed market with a lot of, frankly, just rent-seeking insurance companies that don't really provide any service to customers or to patients or anything, but just suck money out of the system. And that's why our healthcare system is the most expensive in the world, and yet doesn't cover everyone. So it's the worst of both worlds. We pay more and we get less. So that's the base reality. And then Obama came in, and the signature legislative victory of Obama's 8 years was putting together a compromise, putting together a step forward on healthcare coverage. And what it did was still very much in a market logic. It added some government regulation and some government subsidy to help poorer people get healthcare, to bring more people into coverage. It didn't really lower the prices. That's a key thing to understand about the politics of it. Or it didn't lower the prices for everyone. So a significant number of people eventually saw their prices go up. But again, that's because these are private companies. And at the heart of the Obamacare or ACA is this extremely neoliberal idea that it created a mandate, a law that everyone had to go and buy health insurance. Now, and so you can see, obviously, when everybody does that, in theory, lowers prices through the market mechanism. But that's in theory. And so what the insurance companies had was this amazing best of both worlds, where everyone in America was mandated by law to go and buy their product, and if they didn't, they could face fines. And then once that came in, the hope was that then prices would lower, but a bunch of the companies raised premiums after it came into effect. So they raised the fee that you pay to have your health insurance. So at the same time, though, the kind of the less famous or sort of secret success of Obamacare is that it also provided money to states for states to include more people in the what we call the Medicare system and the Medicaid system. So this is the actual public part of our healthcare system. This is basically a public health insurance system. But in order to participate in it, you have to be very poor or disabled or retired. And so what Obamacare did was give money to the states to say, hey, states, you could enlarge the number of people, raise the bars and so forth to allow people to come into this public system, and we'll give you money to do it. And the majority of people who got new coverage under the new system came in that way. So the hidden success of this market-based system is the part of it that was socialized was the most successful and is actually really helping get people care. So then you have Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, the left wing of the party, who have been pushing all during this time to say, hey, why don't we take that successful part of it and just do that, right? Like let's just include more and more people into Medicare and Medicaid, into these public insurance systems. And this is the system that Canada has.
Yes.
So there's debate in the party, and you have the right wing of the party, your Bidens and your Clintons and so forth, who are against that. And so meanwhile, the Republicans took over in Congress, then took over in the president, and they've been in the presidency, and they've been just steadily eliminating parts of the Affordable Care Act, so parts of the Obamacare system. They're trying to just kill it by 1,000 cuts. And there's a court case before the Supreme Court, before our highest court, that will decide on the constitutionality of a key component of the Obamacare system. So that was maybe too much detail, a long way of saying that we made this step forward in healthcare. It wasn't, from my perspective, a big enough step forward. It was politically vulnerable because even although it brought a lot of people into healthcare, for a lot of voters, it didn't lower their prices significantly, and that's what they were concerned about. So Republicans have been able, using their typical anti-government rhetoric, to convince a lot of people that it wasn't a good policy. But the Republicans have no alternative. They don't have another proposal for something else.
Right.
And so a big part of the debate and you heard this in the vice presidential debate, not so much in the presidential debate because you couldn't really hear anything because of our childish or baby president. But a lot of the debate here is, do we preserve Obamacare and perhaps build on it? And then from the Republicans saying we should just eliminate it and start over. And that's kind of where the policy fight is at right now. But we're going to have to, the left of the party, you could say, we're going to have to get very, very loud very quickly if we want to reframe the debate as Obamacare plus, instead of let's just barely hold on to this system that was never really that great to begin with.
And this has been only worsened by coronavirus.
Oh, absolutely. And both in terms of the pressure on the system of healthcare provision, but I'd say actually and then as you said in your question, in your introduction, right?
Yeah.
And this is true anywhere. This isn't just America, but when you have systems of inequality and oppression, the acts of God that come in on top of that, you could say, right? Then they hurt people along those same lines of oppression, whether that's climate change or coronavirus or a flood or fires or whatever, an earthquake, right? It's the poor the people with disabilities. It's people who are socially isolated, right? I mean, I just remember how heartbreaking it was when you see cities that have like heat waves, something that should be a completely survivable natural challenge. It gets really hot, but you
Yeah.
saw it in Paris, in Chicago, in other places that just like a few days of a week or so of just sustained high heat, and lots of people die. And who dies? It's the elderly, it's grandma who nobody visits, who's not in a good home. It's the poor. It's people who are already vulnerable physically for one reason or another. And it was just like heartbreaking watching that in Chicago. All these poor older folks, retired folks who didn't have anybody checking on them, and the same thing happened in Paris. So, so you're right. It's when you have capitalism and inequalities, and then a disaster happens on top of that. Um, the death and the destruction and the suffering tends to follow the lines of oppression within the society. Oh,
Yeah.
but I was going to say, probably in the big picture, in the long run, the way that COVID will interact with our healthcare system is that millions and millions of Americans are the way they get their health insurance is through their employer. Is that as a benefit of work, either because they have a union contract or it's a white collar job and it's part of the benefits package, they get health insurance from their employer. And lots of people are losing their jobs right now because of the economic impact of the pandemic. So whenever you have a lot of people lose their job, that is a public health crisis in the United States because of the stupid way that we do our healthcare system.
Well, yeah, I totally agree with this. We have just one last question. That is, so the outcome of the election is not sure yet, and we still have a long way to go till the 3rd of November, and even from then, we may have still a long way to go due to post-mail ballots.
That's right.
So, I wanted to ask you, if you were to have only 5 minutes to convince someone to vote for the Democratic Party this year, maybe someone who is in a zone who could totally change the result of the election. I'm thinking maybe if you were to convince someone who lives in the Rust Belt, which is a zone that has voted Democrat for a long time and that then voted for Trump at the last election. How would you convince him to vote for Joe Biden this time, and to convince him it's his vote really makes an impact and really big change will come if he decides to vote for Trump or for Biden?
Right. Well, luckily, I mean, the voter that you're talking about, if we're talking about a voter, swing voter, a voter who's moved back and forth in those upper Midwest or Midwest states that we lost last time, shocking. Though, it's easy to convince those voters that their vote is important. I mean, they know it, right? And the entire media, environment for the last 4 years has talked about how they elected Trump. So I think those voters are quite self-aware of their importance, and the conversations that I think are important to have with them, are really about the effects. Like, hey, look, you took a risk. You were like, fuck the system, and you voted for this guy. How's it going? And just really play up the chaos versus stability, brand choice here. I really, I think that the Biden campaign, the Biden-Harris campaign is doing a lot to speak to those voters. I think the bigger problem, the trickier thing, right, is that Clinton could have lost those voters, but held on to or even increased the vote among young people and voters of color in the cities in those states, and won and been the president. I mean, it's such a close election, and the division of the country is so tight, especially in the electoral college. that there's always multiple paths to victory and multiple paths to defeat. So what I worry about with the Biden campaign is them having those 5 minute conversations with those swing voters, but doing less of the 10-minute conversations that you need to have with a young Black voter in in Minneapolis about why their vote matters.
Right.
And it's also in this election about talking to a voter in California who knows for sure that California is going to vote for Joe Biden, and that we'll give our electoral college votes to Joe Biden. Like, how do you get that person to still turn out and vote?
Right.
And that's where I think the conversation about what happens after the election and the fact that we need to have a gigantic majority against Trump. We need a repudiation of his politics. We need everyone in America to be able to say after the election, hey, we had Trumpism and it was rejected soundly. 10 million more people voted against it than for it. That we need that. But we also need a really big margin in the popular vote and as big margins as we can in the electoral college vote, because Trump's not going to accept anything close. And he'll play games with the results. And again, back to the Italian example, his shock troops out there, these racist, thugs, little brown shirts out there in the streets, like they're spoiling. They're ready for a big fight if there's a close and contested election, as are the more genteel shock troops, the lawyers and the pundits and so forth. So my conversations with like young, you could say more progressive voters who are like, God, this Biden guy is so boring, and he keeps talking about how he's gonna frack, and that he's not a progressive, and it's just like making me not want to vote for him. The hard thing, the important conversations we have to have is like, look, we need you. We need every single eligible voter in America to cast a vote and to cast it for Biden and to give a giant fuck you to Trump. Because there's a lot of fights that are going to happen, whatever the result is, after election day.
Well, really, really thank you. Your intervention was really interesting, and we were very, very happy to have you here. And we hope that the election goes as well as it can, and maybe hope to catch up sooner or later. That'd be great.